The room had gone completely silent, which was strange, because a moment ago it had been the loudest place in Ottawa. Beaumont's on Sussex Drive was that kind of restaurant, the kind where silence only happened when something went very, very wrong. Crystal glasses clinked against bone china. The low hum of string quartet music drifted from the far corner. Men in tailored suits leaned toward each other across candlelit tables, trading numbers and favors in the way powerful men had always done, wrapped in the language of fine dining, so it looked civilized from the outside. And then Conrad Whitfield stood up. Not smoothly. Not the way a man who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms and Senate committees was supposed to stand. He lurched upward, knocking his chair back hard enough that it struck the server behind him, sending a tray of water glasses cascading to the marble floor. His hand went to his collar, a Brioni collar, hand-stitched, $240 of Italian silk, and he tore at it like it was made of wire. His face had gone the color of old brick. Harrison. His voice came out wrong, throttled. His business partner, seated across from him, was already half out of his chair. The other 3 men at the table had frozen entirely, the way people freeze when they understand something terrible is happening, but cannot yet name what it is. Harrison, something is. I can't. He didn't finish the sentence. Conrad Whitfield, the man who had built Whitfield Capital from a single-room office in Vanier into a $2.4 billion enterprise, the man who had once told a parliamentary committee that he didn't take orders from anyone, not even the Prime Minister. That man dropped to one knee in the middle of Beaumont's dining room and could not get back up. Within seconds, the silence broke open into chaos. Servers backed away. A woman at the adjacent table let out a sharp, involuntary sound. Harrison Blackwell grabbed Conrad by the shoulder, shouting his name. The maitre d' was already reaching for his phone, and one of the junior executives at the table had gotten to his feet with the panicked, useless energy of someone who wanted very badly to help, and had absolutely no idea how. "Call an ambulance," Harrison kept saying. "Somebody, call an ambulance." But ambulances in Ottawa took 7 minutes on a good night, and Conrad Whitfield, 63 years old, with a family history his cardiologist had been warning him about for a decade, did not look like he had 7 minutes. That was when Olive stepped forward. She had been refilling water glasses at the table beside them, a task she had performed perhaps 4,000 times in the 2 years she'd worked at Beaumont's. Olive Tremblay Nash, 29 years old, 5'4", in her black server's flats, with her dark hair pulled back precisely the way the restaurant's handbook required. She was not supposed to be remarkable in this room. She was part of the furniture in the way that good servers always are, present, efficient, invisible. She set the water pitcher down on the nearest table without looking at it. "Sir," her voice was calm in a way that cut straight through the noise. She was already crouching beside Conrad, 2 fingers pressed to the side of his neck. "Can you hear me?" Conrad's eyes found her face. There was something in them beyond the pain, a flicker of confusion, of indignity, the reflex of a man who had never in his adult life been forced to look up at anyone. "Who the hell?" "Don't talk," she said. "Just breathe. Can you breathe?" He wheezed. "Yes, barely, but yes." Olive's hand moved to his shoulder, steadying him. Her other hand was already gesturing to the nearest server, a young man named Felix. No, she corrected herself, that was the old shift, to Marcus, the floor supervisor who had appeared in the doorway. "I need the AED from the back hall," she said, not loudly, just clearly. "Right now. And keep everyone back." Harrison Blackwell stepped forward with the full force of a man accustomed to controlling situations. "I don't think you should be. Who are you? Where's the manager?" "The AED," Olive said again without looking at him. "Please." Something in her tone stopped him. He stepped back. Conrad's hand had found her wrist. His grip was stronger than she expected, the grip of a man fighting to hold on. There's a condition. My doctors? I know, she said quietly. I can see. You're going to be okay. Just stay with me. She didn't know him. She had never waited on his table before tonight, but she had spent 3 years studying cardiology at the University of Ottawa before the money ran out, and her mother's diagnosis arrived in the same terrible month, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, most likely. The coloring, the grip, the way his chest was working. It fit. She'd seen it once before in her clinical rotation, a professor who had collapsed during a lecture. She had been a second-year student then, watching from the back of the room while the attending physician handled everything. She was not a second-year student anymore. She was just a woman in a black apron who happened to know exactly what to do. The AED arrived. She used it. The room held its breath. Conrad Whitfield did not die on the floor of Beaumont's. By the time the paramedics came through the door 4 minutes and 50 seconds after the call. Olive would remember that number for a long time. Conrad was sitting upright against the wall. His breathing stabilized, his color coming back to something closer to human. One of the paramedics, a compact woman with close-cropped grey hair, knelt beside him and began her assessment. She looked up at Olive. You the one who used the defib? Yes? Timing? Approximately 90 seconds after onset of symptoms. The paramedic held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once with the economy of someone who understood what that timing meant. They took Conrad out on a stretcher. Harrison Blackwell went with him. The other executives stood in a cluster near the bar, speaking in low voices. The dining room had mostly cleared. The maitre d' had quietly suggested to the remaining guests that their meals would, of course, be comped tonight. Olive picked up her water pitcher from the table where she'd left it. She finished her shift. She thought about it on the bus home. The 95 out to Barhaven, 40 minutes, if the Queensway was moving. She sat near the back with her coat over her server uniform and her bag in her lap, and looked out at the orange smear of city lights on the Ottawa River and thought about whether she had done the right thing. Not medically, that she was certain of. She thought about whether it was her place, whether she should have stayed back and let someone else. Someone with credentials currently attached to their name, someone with a license and a hospital ID, step in. But there had been no one else, and the man had been dying. Her mother was awake when she got home. Elspeth Tremblay Nash had been awake most nights for the past 14 months, ever since the treatment started, the kind of awake that had nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with the particular discomfort of a body that was fighting something enormous. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her housecoat with a cup of chamomile tea and the crossword from the previous Sunday's Citizen, half finished, pencil resting in the groove of the fold. "You're late," Elspeth said. "Not accusatory, just observing." There was a thing. Olive hung up her coat. Someone collapsed in the restaurant. Elspeth looked up. "Are they all right? I think so." "That's good." She picked up her pencil. 14 down. Physician's instrument. 7 letters. "I keep wanting to write scalpel, but that's only 7 if you count wrong." Olive sat down across from her and looked at the grid. "Forceps top." "Oh!" Elspeth wrote it in. Of course. They sat there for a while in the kitchen that smelled like chamomile and the particular quiet of a house where someone was sick, and Olive didn't tell her mother the rest of it. Didn't tell her that her hands had been steady in that room in a way they hadn't been in a very long time, that something had come back to her tonight like a language she'd been pretending she'd forgotten. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well. 3 days later, Beaumont's received a call requesting a reservation, a private dining room, the smaller one on the second floor, for a party of 2. Under the name Blackwell, the reservation came with a specific request. Could the server Olive be assigned to the table? The floor manager, a meticulous man named Giles, who had been running front of house at Beaumont's for 11 years, mentioned this to Olive before her shift with the mild discomfort of someone delivering news they couldn't quite categorize. "It's unusual," he said, "but the reservation is for the private room, so you'll be on your own up there. Is that all right?" "Of course," Olive said, "because what else did you say?" She didn't know who Harrison Blackwell was, exactly, not beyond the fact that he was the man at Conrad's table who had tried to move her out of the way. She looked him up on her phone in the staff room before the reservation. Blackwell Capital Partners, real estate and private equity, with holdings across Ottawa, Toronto, and Calgary. He was on the board of 3 charitable foundations and had been photographed at enough ribbon-cutting ceremonies to suggest he understood the value of being seen doing good things. He arrived alone, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed the party of 2 would be 2 men in suits, more of what she'd seen the other night. But he walked in alone and sat down and waited, and he didn't look at his phone the way people in that tax bracket usually did when they were early to something. He looked at his hands. When Olive brought the menus, he looked up, and she saw that he was older than she'd registered in the chaos the other night. Somewhere in his mid-50s. He had the kind of face that had once been very handsome and had settled into something more interesting. "Thank you for coming," he said, which was a strange thing to say to a server in the restaurant where she worked, but she didn't remark on it. "Of course! Can I get you something to start?" "Water would be fine." He paused. "The second reservation it's for Conrad. He asked me to arrange this. He'll be about 15 minutes. Harrison's jaw worked briefly. He's not quite at full strength yet." "That's understandable," Olive said. 3 days is very soon." Harrison looked at her steadily. "You know how close it was?" "Yes." The cardiologist at the Civic told him that the intervention in those first 2 minutes made a significant difference in the outcome. He said it carefully, like someone who had rehearsed it, and then decided the rehearsed version felt too formal, and was now navigating between. He wanted to say that to you directly. Conrad isn't always very good at saying things directly. She brought the water. She brought bread. She moved quietly around the room in the way she had learned to do, that practiced near invisibility that good service required, while Harrison Blackwell sat at the table and seemed to be thinking hard about something. Conrad arrived at 7:40. He moved more carefully than she imagined he usually did, and there was a monitoring patch visible at his collar where his shirt had shifted, and he looked smaller in some way that had nothing to do with his physical size. He was still in a suit. Some things you didn't abandon even when your body had just staged a full revolt against you. He sat down. He looked at Olive. "You're the one," he said. "I work here, yes." "That's not what I meant." He put his hands flat on the table. "They told me what you did, the sequence of it, the timing." He stopped. "I'm not good at this," Harrison mentioned. Conrad made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I imagine he did." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the candle in the center of the table. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Not the way a server answers a customer. Just honestly." "All right. What were you doing waiting tables?" It was not a cruel question. She had braced for something cruel. Some version of a person with your abilities shouldn't be wasting time like this, the kind of observation that sounded like a compliment and functioned like a small knife. But it didn't come out that way. It came out like a genuine question from a man trying to understand something that didn't quite fit the shape of the world as he had understood it. "My mother is sick," Olive said. She was diagnosed 14 months ago, renal carcinoma, stage 3. I was in my 3rd year at U of O. Medicine. She paused. The word still felt strange in her mouth after all this time of not saying it. I had to stop. The schedule wasn't compatible with being her primary caregiver, and the student loans weren't going to stretch to cover her medications without me working full-time. She said it in the same tone she used to describe the specials, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had learned that when you said difficult things in a measured voice, people were more likely to actually hear them. Beaumont's pays well and the shifts work around her treatment schedule. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 men absorbing something they hadn't known how to expect. Harrison had a pen in his hand without appearing to have taken it out. He set it back down. "How long until she's— What's the prognosis?" Conrad asked. "Cautiously optimistic, her oncologist says. She's responding well, but the next round of treatment starts in 6 weeks, and it's more aggressive than the last one." Olive looked at the table. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. You asked me to be honest, I know." Conrad picked up his water glass and held it without drinking from it. "I'm asking because I'm trying to figure out what would actually help, as opposed to what would make me feel better about still being alive." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest shifted, just slightly. She had not expected that particular sentence from a man like Conrad Whitfield. "I don't know what would help," she said truthfully. "I haven't thought about it in those terms." "Then think about it now." She did. She stood there in the private dining room at Beaumont's on Sussex Drive, with its cream-coloured walls and its Krieghoff print, and its single window looking out onto the canal. And she thought about it properly for the first time since she'd left the university without finishing her degree. "I want to go back to school," she said. "I want to finish what I started. That's the only thing I've ever actually wanted, if we're being honest." "Then that's what we'll arrange," Conrad said. It was not a complicated sentence. He said it the way he probably said most things, with the flat certainty of a man who understood that money, applied correctly, could resolve a remarkable number of the world's structural problems. But underneath it, or maybe around it, there was something else. Something that sounded, very quietly, like relief. She didn't say yes immediately. That surprised them, she could tell. People didn't say no to Conrad Whitfield, or even pause on the way to saying yes, and the pause she offered, polite, genuine, absolute, landed in the room like a dropped fork. "I need to understand what you're proposing," she said. "Specifically." Harrison explained it. A medical education fund, established under the Whitfield Foundation, covering tuition, living expenses, and her mother's treatment costs for the duration of Olive's degree and residency. In exchange, nothing, no contractual obligation, no naming rights, no expectation of employment within Whitfield's portfolio companies. A straightforward gift, structured as a grant. "Why?" Olive asked. Conrad looked at her. "Because you gave me my life back. I performed a standard emergency intervention. The AED did most of the work. Don't do that." His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't minimize it because you're in this room, and I'm Conrad Whitfield, and it feels like the modest thing to do. The paramedic told me. The cardiologist told me. The timing was the difference." He set his water glass down. "You could have walked past. You could have stood back and assumed someone else would handle it. A lot of people in that room had better reasons to step forward than you did. You were there to pour water." She thought about the bus home on the 95. She thought about whether it had been her place. "It was my place," she said, and she said it out loud without quite meaning to. Conrad nodded once, slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already decided. "Then let me do mine," he said. She talked to her mother that night. not in the careful, managed way she usually talked to Elspeth about things. That voice she'd developed over the past 14 months, the voice that was steady and warm and carefully did not contain fear. But honestly, the way Conrad had asked her to be earlier, she sat down at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, and she told her mother everything. Elspeth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Olive loved most about her. When Olive finished, Elspeth was quiet for a moment, turning her mug in both hands. Then she said, "What are you going to tell them? I was going to ask you what you thought. I know you were." Elspeth looked up. "I'm asking what you think." Olive looked at the crossword on the table, still half finished from 3 nights ago. "I think." She stopped, started again. "I think I've been telling myself for 14 months that I chose this, that I made a decision with both eyes open, and I don't regret it. And that's true. I don't regret it. But I miss it." The words came out smaller than she expected them to. "I miss knowing things. I miss being in rooms where people were trying to understand something hard. I miss—" her throat tightened briefly. "I just miss it." Elspeth reached across the table and put her hand over Olive's. Her hands were thinner than they used to be. They were still her mother's hands. "Call them tomorrow," Elspeth said. "Tell them yes." She called Harrison the next morning from the parking lot of the Low Bloors on Merivale because she'd been running errands and she didn't want to have the conversation inside the store for reasons she couldn't have fully articulated. He answered on the second ring. "I'd like to accept," she said, "if the offer still stands." "Of course it does," Harrison said, and he sounded. She couldn't be entirely sure, but she thought she heard something that was almost relief. "Conrad will be very glad to hear it." There was paperwork, of course. There was always paperwork. She met with the Foundation's legal team in a glassy tower on Metcalfe Street, 2 lawyers named Preston something and someone else who went too fast for her to catch the name. And she read everything twice and asked questions when she had them, and signed where she needed to sign. She went back to Beaumont's the following Monday. She had 2 weeks left on her notice period. She'd given it the day after she called Harrison. And Jill's had been quietly devastated and professionally gracious in the particular way of someone who has learned to hold those 2 things at once. She worked her shifts well. She filled water glasses and carried plates and described the seasonal menu to people who barely looked at her, and she did it as well on her last 2 weeks as she had done on every other shift, because that had always been the kind of person she was. On her final night, the kitchen sent out a small cake with her last table's dessert order. The pastry team had made something with blueberries, because someone had mentioned she was from New Brunswick originally. And Marcus led a round of applause that embarrassed her enormously and moved her more than she was prepared for. She had not expected to love this job. She had taken it because it paid, and the hours worked, and the tips were good. But she had been here for 2 years, and the people in this kitchen had learned her mother's name and texted her on hard days and swapped shifts when the treatment made everything complicated, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She said goodbye to all of them. The University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine didn't simply let people resume where they'd left off. There was a process, an assessment, a committee that reviewed her file and her reasons for withdrawal and her academic record from her original enrollment. She had gone into that meeting expecting to have to fight for something and had come out of it with a start date for the winter semester, which was not what she'd anticipated. The committee chair, a professor named Dr. Worthing, whom Olive had never met but whose papers she had read in second year, had looked at her file for a long time and then looked at Olive and said, "You left with a 3.9 GPA, yes. And you're coming back, why exactly?" I want to hear it in your words. Because I want to be a physician, Olive said. That's it. That's all I've got. Dr. Worthing had nodded slowly, capped her pen. Then welcome back, Miss Tremblay-Nash. We'll see you in January. She had sat in her car in the parking lot on King Edward Avenue for quite a long time after that meeting, with her hands in her lap, watching the snow begin. She saw Conrad once more before the winter semester began. Not at Beaumont's, and not in a boardroom. At the Civic Hospital, of all places, where her mother had an appointment with her oncologist. She was sitting in the waiting room with a 2-month-old copy of Chatelaine and a paper cup of terrible coffee when she heard her name. He was there for a follow-up. He looked significantly better than he had at Beaumont's. The colour was back in his face, and he was moving without that careful quality he'd had in the private dining room. He sat down across from her without asking if the seat was taken, which she had decided was simply how he operated in rooms. "How is she doing?" he asked, which surprised her because she hadn't told him her mother would be here. "She has an appointment today," Olive said. "We're hoping the latest scans show what her doctor thinks they'll show, which is reduction." Conrad nodded. He seemed to be deciding something. "I know her oncologist, as it happens," he said finally. "Dr. Yoon. She's exceptional, she is," Olive agreed. "My mother thinks very highly of her. She should." He straightened his jacket, a gesture that seemed automatic rather than vain. "I didn't arrange that, in case you were wondering. That's a coincidence." "I know," Olive said, and she did know. Conrad Whitfield was, she had concluded over the past several weeks, a man who was less interested in managing impressions than in getting things right, a quality she associated with competence and also with having nothing left to prove. They sat together in the waiting room for a while, the billionaire and the woman who would be a doctor, both of them waiting on news about people they cared about, the antiseptic smell of the hospital around them, and the winter light coming pale and flat through the window. "Thank you," he said, eventually, not for any specific thing, just the 2 words offered quietly, in the way of a man who had spent decades speaking in large rooms and was only now getting comfortable with the smaller statements. "Thank you," she said back, and she meant it in the same way. Without footnotes, without qualifiers, without the managed distance that had become her default register when she was at work. Her mother's name was called. Olive stood up, tucked the magazine back into the rack, threw her coffee cup away. At the door of the waiting room she looked back once. Conrad gave her a single nod, the same one he'd offered across the chaos of the dining room 3 weeks ago. Steady, certain, no excess motion. She went in. The results were what Dr. Ewan had hoped for. Significant reduction. The treatment was working. They would continue the current protocol through spring, reassess in June, and if the response held, there was genuine cause for optimism. Elspeth cried in the car, quietly, looking out the window. Olive held her hand and did not cry until they were home, sitting at the kitchen table, and then she cried for a long time in the uncomplicated, exhausted way of someone releasing something they'd been holding very carefully for 14 months. The crossword was still on the table. She picked up the pencil and finished it. January came. She walked back into the Faculty of Medicine building on the morning of the first day of the winter semester, and the building smelled the same, coffee and photocopier toner and that specific cold that comes off institutional flooring in a Canadian winter, and everything in her chest said yes and finally and you're back all at once. She sat in the 3rd row, not the back, the way she had when she was uncertain of herself at 21. The 3rd row, where you could see everything clearly and the professor could see you clearly, and there was no ambiguity about who you were and what you were there for. Dr. Worthing began the lecture. Olive opened her notebook. She thought, briefly, of Conrad Whitfield's hands flat on the restaurant table. She thought of her mother's hands, thinner than they used to be, but still her mother's hands. She thought of the 95 bus and the orange lights on the river, and the way she had sat there, wondering whether it had been her place to step forward. She picked up her pen. It had been her place. It had always been her place. Some things are true not because anyone grants them to you, but because you already know them. Deep in the part of yourself that trained for years and loved the work, and carried the knowledge even when the circumstances made it impossible to say so out loud. She had just needed for a moment the world to agree.